Hi there, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. If I look a little bit nervous, it's nothing to do with the fact that I'm looking at a crowd of about 700 people in a lecture theatre of unquantifiable size, and everything to do with the fact that I saw 3 students outside during the lunch break with enormous nets, and I went up to them and I said, "What are you collecting?" And they looked me up and down and they said, "Folklorists." So keep your wits about you if you're a folklorist. If you look at your program, you'll notice I changed the title. I was probably feeling unduly magnanimous when I wrote the abstract. I think I said something like giving space to community groups. Of course, we don't give space, we really do make space. And I'll get into that in a little bit. Just to very briefly give you some context, and it's not sort of to personalize this really, but to give you a context for probably what happens in a lot of folklore archives. I work 4 days a week, and I would say probably about 125% of my workload is dedicated to teaching, and another 25% is to public events and community engagement projects and archives. So you're often looking at people who are sort of under pressure from lots of different sides who maybe don't have that institutional support that you get in other archives. So I'll just quickly go through the structure of my talk. I'll just introduce the Elphinstone Institute Archives very briefly, and then I'll give you an introduction to 2 archival projects that we've participated in, working with local organizations, community groups, and individuals. And then I'll spend the rest of the talk trying to unpack those terms in the title of my talk. So those terms being community groups, what do we mean by community, the idea of making space, and the ideas of access and shape. So just very briefly, the Elphinstone Institute Archives, repository for the diverse vernacular cultural expressions in the northeast of Scotland. You can see here the annual human sacrifice in the village of Burgh Head. And they're a relatively recent addition to traditional archives and folklore archives. So they were founded in 1996, and I was very happy to see that they're the same age as the Cork Folklore Project, so we're in good company. And you get an idea of the extent of the collections. And like many other traditions archives, we sort of run the full breadth of what might be considered folklore. And most of the materials result from fieldwork conducted by staff and students over the years, but they also include donations from the local community, from the general public in the northeast of Scotland, and also materials collected in the course of community engagement and public-facing projects. And it's important to note that unlike some of the older recordings in the School of Scottish Studies archives, where you get Hamish Henderson or Callum MacLean going up to somebody and say, "Sing me a song, Jeanine," and they get 15 or 20 songs on one tape. Most of our recordings are more, tell us why you sing a song, tell us what the songs mean to you. And so in that sense, they're a little bit different from that. A question I've been having the past wee while is really, what kind of archives are the Elphinstone Institute archives? Are we institutional archives? Certainly I'm friends with the head of special collections at the University of Aberdeen, and we've got some connections to them, but really we sort of work in some isolation. Are we community archives? Certainly, if you were to talk to people in the Northeast who knew about us, they would probably see us as a sort of local area archive, where if they were wanting to give a legacy of their materials, they would think about us and offer us their materials. And also thinking, are we activist archives? Are all folklore archives activist archives? So, for example, during lockdown, like many other folklorists, I coordinated a project documenting creative responses to the pandemic, and one of the things, of course, that happened was the murder of George Floyd and the sort of regaining momentum of the Black Lives Matter movement. So we were documenting this across the Northeast, and of course other things, anti-lockdown protests, anti-vaccination stickers, things like that. And I started thinking, well, I'm very comfortable working with anti-racist groups in my community work, and in fact one of the projects that I'm working with is sort of an anti-racist project in many ways. Would I be comfortable working with an anti-vax group? That might be on the limit of comfort for me. And would I want to work with a white supremacist group in the Northeast? The answer is no, I probably wouldn't. Does that make me as bad as those 19th century collectors who refused to include bawdy songs in their collections? Possibly. And so maybe in that sense there's an activist side to all of our collections, especially when we're thinking about traditional archives. So just to quickly go through the 2 projects, the first one is Prejudice and Solidarity, Archived Throughout History, the PATH project. It's a Heritage Lottery funded project, and it's coordinated by Grampian Regional Equality Council and 4 Pillars, which is an LGBT plus community group in Aberdeen. And the goal is to broaden awareness of the archival record of less visible communities in Aberdeen, and to also create new archival records reflecting those communities. The second project is Voices, the Community Story, which is coordinated by the Scottish Council on Archives in partnership with regional archives across Scotland, including ours. And the goal was to document stories of so-called new Scots. If I put my migration studies hat on, that's a term that I have some issues with, but it's a really, really interesting project. So, and just sorry to quickly say that you'll be hearing quotes from the 2 coordinators, one from GREC and one from 4 Pillars, who are both sort of members of their respective communities in the rest of this presentation. And then you'll also be hearing from one of the volunteers from the VCS project, a Syrian woman who is interviewing Syrian refugees in Aberdeen about their experiences. So I was wondering, what do we actually mean by community? What is a community group? I mean, community is such an important term to folklorists, but it's really quite ambiguous. It can be used in lots of different contexts with different meanings and intentions. It's one of these words like integration. What do we actually mean by these terms? I heard a really interesting possible definition yesterday in a conversation during a tea break. Somebody said a community is a group of people in which infighting thrives. If there's no infighting, then it's not a community. This was said in the context of Irish folklorists, but I'm sure it applies to I won't say who said it. I'm sure it applies to all different academic groups around the world. But I thought we'd start off with a quote from Sahar, who looks at maybe outsiders' understanding of the Syrian community in Aberdeen.
But they are very different, as one can imagine. The people from the north of Syria, people from the south, people from the middle, people from the Shire of Damascus. There is no connection, although we speak the same language, and like people were displaced because of the same reason, the war. But people in the same street, they don't talk to each other. But here, it took also the people involved, like the council and volunteers, years to realize this.
So I think that's a really important unpacking. It's the kind of thing when we actually listen to the people who are working on these projects, how they define these terms, rather than how we as archivists or folklorists sort of put our sort of theoretical definitions onto them. And a very different kind of interpretation of community from Jakub from 4 Pillars.
Even though, as I mentioned, I mentioned my community, it doesn't necessarily mean that I have very intense ties to it personally. I involve myself in LGBT plus events on a rather sparse basis, but the ones that I do tend to mean a lot to me because they're about, commemorating certain days. They're about celebration of certain aspects of our community. But what it actually means for me is both people who are like me, but also the aspect of people who understand me. I find people who perhaps don't share my sexual or gender expression, but they understand me. I personally do count them as part of the community, even though a lot of people would say that they don't belong in the LGBT plus community because they don't self-identify as LGBT plus. But who makes the community of the people that are in it?
So I think that's, again, a really important point, allowing our partners to define their terms and to make sense of what they mean in their own projects. So part of this is what we're talking about when we say making space. And when I think about making space, I immediately go back to the time when I lived in Paris, and it was early in the morning, and I was trying to stuff myself into one of the metro cars. And you'd sort of see a little gap there, and you'd try to make your way into it, and somebody would have to move a little bit to the side, and you'd just have to sort of shove in a little bit, and you might make space for somebody coming in after you. And maybe you just grab a handle and you're good to go, and then suddenly somebody stands on your toe, but you can't really say anything, and so that sort of awkwardness. There's an awkwardness in making space. Things aren't always easy. So it's about compromise, it's about patience, it's about finding time, but you have to work quickly, of course, to support partners. You have to be open, but you also have to manage institutional expectations, external expectations, and of course your own expectations about a project, because most of the time you're not the one in charge. You have to make room for other people's understandings. So you've got to balance that aspiration, like what Clíona was talking about yesterday. We always want to do deliberately slow, diligent, nuanced work, but we also have to balance that with time-limited funding of projects and the limited time of partners. If we're working with volunteers, they may be working on the weekends, maybe they've got full-time jobs, maybe they've, they're carers. There's lots of different things that are happening there. And of course, we have to share our knowledge. We have to use our institutional power to support unofficial or less visible groups, maybe going back to that idea of activist archives. But we also have to recognize that others are the experts. And I think folklorists are quite good at that. We realize that we're not the experts in the room most of the time. It's the people we're speaking to who are the experts. And in an archival sense, I think that's useful as well. So let them choose the direction.
What I've seen is that what I imagined prejudice and solidarity was at the start of the project has expanded so much since just working with a group of volunteers. As I said, my background was more like activist, like kind of equality work. So in my head, I was imagining recording like activists and looking at demonstrations or like these kind of movements and events. For some people, just the experience of these communities, like have like prejudice and solidarity embedded through it. It's not something outside of those experiences, like activism can be. This project has really taught me that sometimes it's like really fun to just leave people lead you and just see where it's going.
So I thought that was interesting because I was really letting Louise and Jakub lead their project, and they in turn were working with volunteers and letting the volunteers shape the project. We'll just go to another quote here.
This is based on most of the people I met and I know in the community. Such a project is not high. So these women who I interviewed, 3 of them, they have an interest in writing or storytelling to start with. So this is why the project wasn't attractive. But then the majority, no. It's like, I would say the domestic needs and demands, that's what it matters to them. That they settle, easy life, safer life compared to what they have been through or what they endured because of the war and, through the whole asylum journey or refugee journey.
So part of making space is also being aware of when people don't want to be involved and not trying to involve everybody and realizing that people have other things to do than participate in archival projects and you can't involve everybody that you would want to. You have to realize what the circumstances of their own everyday lives are. So finally, I'll just move on to access and shaping. What do we mean by that, or what do I mean, and what do the people in the projects mean by that? So I think it's important to say that access is two-way. It's not just a case of archives giving access to materials. It's also a case of individuals and communities giving archives access to their knowledge, expertise, and lived experience. And I think it's easy for us to think, all right, we're giving access to people, but really it's a two-way street. And it's the same thing with shaping. Archives and their collections can be shaped by external contributors and projects, but those community contributors can be shaped by their interactions with the archives as well. And I think we've seen a lot of this in a lot of the papers we've been hearing the past 2 days. So I'll just play 2 last quotes and then that'll be the end.
The early stages are always a little bit awkward because it is approaching a public institution, and in many circumstances that's the most dreaded thing you can do as an adult, is approaching a public figure or public institution, trying to reach out saying, well, I have this thing to ask, is this not too much, or is this relevant, or will they have this?
So again, one thing that's sort of important to realize, it's easy for us to forget. I'm sitting in my office, I think I'm a friendly, open guy, I don't think anybody should be intimidated to come and speak to me, and yet just by virtue of the fact that we're based in a university, which is, in a part of Aberdeen that a lot of people in different neighbourhoods of Aberdeen would never think of going to the university. They don't see it as a place that's open to them. They don't see it as a place that's sort of where they would feel comfortable being. And so we need to remember how those archive users approach us and what they think about that sort of intimidation factor. And then, just thinking about that idea of shaping, and Sahar talking about the project and working with the Syrian refugees and how it shaped her and shaped the volunteers she was speaking with.
Like the women really, it's least the one I interviewed, they welcomed the idea, they appreciated, they felt like, appreciated themselves, like someone is keen to hear their stories and record it in this way, because I remember we joked a little bit. I said, imagine like 100 years later, your, say, grandchildren will go to a museum and, they will pick up names or images. That would be something really unique. I had the training. I learned how to use the equipment from the university, and then I practiced also like making these interviews, and then around storytelling. This is, just if we look around us in the world, storytelling become a very big thing, and it's so powerful. And it just like, to be honest, I felt personally very empowered, and they felt very empowered as well.
So that's a sort of a positive response. And not every response to working in an archival project will be positive like that. Some people will have been maybe negatively shaped by it. I think we certainly were hearing about the effects of secondary trauma and people encountering difficult accounts and things like that. And there's lots of different ways of processing this kind of thing. I guess, so I've given you a very limited selection, and I've just tried to isolate a few salient points. There's obviously much more to unpack here, but I guess the principal idea is that I think all of us could spend more time listening to our project partners and trying to get a better understanding of their participation in the project. So I just wanted to finish by thanking the organizers, in particularly Kelly, Marina, and Caroline for all of their help and their patience, and of course thanks to my contributors, Sahar Abdullah, Louise Henrard, and Jakub Iwanecki, and Dave Black, who I also interviewed, but he was sort of the head of GREC, and it just couldn't quite fit into time, but really interesting contributions as well. So please do contact me, and of course come visit us in Aberdeen. It's only an hour and 10 minutes or 20 minutes from Dublin by plane, as I discovered 2 days ago. So come on over.